Okay, so we'll go through some housekeeping stuff and then we'll kind of jump into material here today. Um, so that quiz number 1 is currently still available, and that's due by the end of the day tomorrow. So I've got a set of practice problems up there on Canvas as you're kind of thinking about taking that. I uploaded a new version of it. It just replaced the old one. So if you had downloaded the old version, I would kind of replace it. I just clarified the wording. I believe it was problem 16 and 18. I had some wording that could have been confusing or misleading, so I kind of updated that so that there's not as much confusion on those problems or any kind of misunderstanding. I also added in this Excel file, which we'll be using today. So it's got a blank version and a completed version. So we'll complete this in class, but I want to make sure you kind of had, 2 different tabs. We'll see what this looks like once we open it up here today. So I'll make sure we have this kind of ready to go. And then there was some issues with quiz 2 in the sense that not for this section, but for the other section, it had an older version. So what I'm going to do for this June 25th daily quiz is I'm actually going to give credit as long as you submitted any answers. So that will be reflected after that due date passes, which is before class tomorrow. So that should, my mistake is your gain. In this section, there wasn't really an issue, but the other one there was. And so if you're watching, I posted videos from each section. And so there was a little bit of an inconsistency. So I'll give everybody credit as long as you submit something for that June 24th quiz. And then I will post a version of that quiz that looks the same for both sections, where you'll have the answers. So that will be a good kind of quiz as we're getting closer to that first exam to kind of start reviewing those questions for the exam. Other than that, that module 3 reading was due before we started class today because we'll start covering module 3. Module 4 is up there. We won't start covering module 4 until next Monday. So make sure you're just getting on, completing that before the beginning of class on Monday. I've got the outline. Once I get back to my office today, I'll put up those slides. We'll start with those on Monday, so you'll have them well in advance. I'll also put up this Excel file. Can't currently see these, but you'll see those pop up after class today. And we have this daily quiz. Once again, don't open it until we kind of start reviewing it here in class today. And then if you're watching this recording not live, this will be kind of due by the beginning of class on Monday. Other than that, any questions from me before we get started here? Once again, I'll try to keep my best eye on the chat. If I ever miss something, feel free to unmute and kind of let me know. Usually if I'm finishing up something, maybe it'll take 30 seconds, but. All right, so let's see. So we're meeting tomorrow. Yeah, so we're still kind of meeting tomorrow. The only day we don't have, so I don't have office hours on Friday scheduled. Although if you email me, we can meet by appointment, really outside of class time. The only day we don't have class, I believe, if you look at the schedule, would be next Friday, which we have off for Independence Day. Any other questions before we get going here? Okay, so So we're going to start talking about GDP, or the gross domestic product of an economy, here today. Just kind of a starting out, this is, I think, from Top Hat, but I wanted to kind of explain this a little bit more in depth. So when we're thinking about our economy, right? Consumers have expenditures where they buy things from businesses, right? You go and you purchase goods. Now, businesses have expenditures in that whatever their kind of workers are, whatever loans they have, whatever kind of capital or machinery that they have, those are all going to households. Right? They're paying workers' wages. It's probably the easiest way to think about that. So these are our expenditures from both households and businesses. But anytime a consumer buys something, a business was creating some output. So we kind of think of this output is going to be not an expenditure for the business, but this is going to be something they're earning income off of, right? When they sell it to households. And then households, the income they're receiving, right? That's an expenditure by businesses, which is kind of matched with the fact that households are providing their services to businesses. So we typically think about the sale and purchase of goods, right? There's also the expenditures and the kind of income generated, between businesses and households as well. So we'll look at two approaches to calculating GDP here today, and they kind of rely on the circular flow. So every economic exchange, if you buy something, right, that money goes to someone else. So anytime you purchase a good, company makes money. Anytime they have to pay you wages, right, then you're earning money off of them, right, which means you're providing some output or some number of hours of labor to them, right? So every exchange, we have kind of a buyer and seller. So think about it this way, I kind of already said this, but anytime consumers spend money, producers are also going to incur costs to produce that product. Anytime you receive wages or compensation, you're creating output for those businesses, right? Those employees are creating output for those companies. So we kind of have this circular flow, which means we'll have two ways of measuring GDP. Okay. So what is the gross domestic product, or we'll kind of shorthand this with GDP? It's going to be the total market value of all final goods and services that are produced within an economy, within the domestic borders of that nation. And typically we measure this at one specific point in time. So we can measure GDP by week, month, year, right? But we're looking at the sale of all final goods at one specific point in time. So you can kind of think about, well, what's the total market value of goods that are produced? Well, it's going to be the number of goods that are produced times whatever the value or the price of those goods are. So we're really thinking about, we would look at every single good and we would add up the quantity of that good times its kind of average price. So this would be our GDP. Now we could do this for very specific like categories of goods. So we could be like, I could look at what was the quantity and price sold of a specific type of laptop, right? And then we could also break this down into categories, which is going to be a much easier way to calculate this, which is like the average quantity of laptops of each kind purchased times their price. So if we're using current prices, right, what kind of value would GDP always measure? So if I'm using the current year's prices, that doesn't account for that prices vary across time. So this would be our nominal GDP or a nominal value. So we're going to have some issues with GDP that arise later, which is if I'm using the nominal value, right, potentially year to year, even if quantity was the same, those prices might have went up, in which case our economy is still producing the same number of goods, but our GDP, our nominal GDP would be higher. So we'll kind of talk about how we resolve this issue later on, but for right now, we're going to think more about how is this nominal value of GDP calculated? Okay. So what is going to be counted in our GDP? Okay? It's going to be, and I already said this, but the final goods and services that are purchased or produced in an economy. So intermediate goods that haven't been used in production would be included, right? Because up to this point, the final good that we have is whatever the intermediate good is at in the process of creating the final good. So this would be something like, I think I gave the example last class, we have all these semiconductors. If they haven't been used yet to produce electronic products, then we don't have any electronic products that are being produced and consumed. So we kind of stop at whatever that last intermediate good would be, or in this example, kind of whatever the sale and production of semiconductors would be. So those would get added in. But as soon as we have those final products, those electronic products, we no longer factor in the purchase and production of those semiconductors. We only include in the production and consumption of those electronic products. Same kind of idea would be for raw materials, right? If we're seeing, any type of metal that is being produced and consumed or produced and purchased in an economy, if it hasn't yet been used, so metal hasn't yet been used to produce, rebar. So that this is in my mind because I saw they were replacing some roads and sidewalks that needed rebar to reinforce them. But if those haven't been produced yet, then that final good wouldn't exist. Okay, so intermediate goods, raw materials would kind of be one of those. They wouldn't get counted if the final goods had been produced, but if the final goods haven't been produced, they would be included in our GDP. So what is not counted already said this, but any intermediate good or raw materials that have already been used to create a final good, right? We're only including whatever that, whatever good we're at in that process, whatever that current final good is. Used goods also don't get counted in. They've already been produced, so if they're being sold again, we still have the same number of units, right? And so we don't want to kind of double count that, so we don't include used goods. Any type of transfer payments, so if something's already been produced and consumed, but we're just redistributing that wealth, we haven't seen any more units kind of produced, we're just redistributing the value of that. Maybe think about this as taxes, and then they're used to kind of given individuals through their welfare programs. Those aren't going to be counted. It's just redistributing what we currently have produced. So subsidies, right, would be an example of this, not just taxes. Any non-market activities won't be included. So these would be things like unpaid household work. So we're not really capturing in GDP the value, right, of a stay-at-home parent, right? If that parent wasn't staying at home, we would see they have to pay for daycare, etc. That would get added into the GDP. But if they're just staying at home, we have no measure of what their production is or what hours they're using to, say, watch their children and do chores around the house. So the problem with this is that always means our GDP will be understated, because the current estimate is that 10 to 15% of all production would actually be unpaid household work. And then we have illegal goods, right? Those aren't tracked. Estimates are that's 5%. You know, this is sale of drugs, right? Things that are illegal. So let's see here. That question. So the GDP has nothing to do with being sold and all items being sold. So GDP is more like stock. You can think of it as the stock as quantity when we're thinking about like used goods or transfer payments. Technically, these non-market activities and illegal goods, they're being produced, but there's no way of tracking those so they don't end up in our GDP. So technically, GDP wouldn't capture the production of all goods. If you think about it, it's only legal goods, in which case we can observe the production and consumption. We can't really observe the production, and it's kind of weird because there really is no consumption of, say, unpaid household work. The same individual is producing and consuming that good. So it's only goods that we can kind of track there, the number of units that are being produced. Okay. So with kind of this definition, we can also think about some other issues that might exist with GDP if we're making this calculation, right? Or to think a little bit harder about how this calculation is made. So it's the total market value of all final goods. So this wouldn't include intermediate goods if we see that those final goods have already been produced. So a nice kind of example of this is, and I think I stole this from the book, but a further explanation and kind of breaking this down is, if I'm seeing, let's say baked goods being sold at a local coffee shop. Well, how did I get that final product? Well, first we had to see, maybe the wheat, right? We had to be planted. We had to use fertilizer to grow this crop. Once we grow that crop, right, there's some costs associated with maintaining that field to kind of make sure we get to the final, why am I blanking on the word? The final actual agricultural product. And then once that fully grown agricultural product exists, like wheat, we then kind of go through a production process of milling it and baking it, then kind of selling it at our storefront. So if we take the dollar value at each one of these intermediate steps, we added them all up, we would see that the total dollar value of all these sales would be 96%, right? In order to create a baked good, I would have to kind of purchase the milled wheat. To mill the wheat, I'd have to purchase the actual crop. To get the crop, I would actually have to purchase fertilizer and seed. And so if we add all this up, this wouldn't be the amount that's included in GDP, because this is the total value at each of the intermediate processes. You can think of what GDP is really measuring is the value added of each one of these sales of the intermediate product. So going from nothing to this fertilizer, we're adding kind of 3 cents of value. From that fertilizer to actually growing the product, we're adding 3 more cents, et cetera, et cetera. So if we added up this value added, we actually end up with the same cost or the same price of the final product. So we are only using essentially the value added of each intermediate step, which would give us the total value of that final product. Okay. You can think about it as each level, right, exists here of the intermediate process of creating this good. The good is produced and then sold. And so we're not looking at how much each one made, because that production and consumption would kind of be thinking about cancel each other out until that final price is kind of passed on to consumers for the final sale of that product. So if we're thinking about, then we have these final goods, that's all that we're including in our gross domestic product. Why do we care about this measure, right? Well, I mean, in general, if you think about it, as we see output increase in an economy, we see more goods and services being purchased and produced. That generally is a good thing for that economy, right? We have, utility of consumers. If they're able to buy more goods, higher quality goods, we're going to see utility of our population grow. Also, businesses are increasing their sales. This is generally a good thing. Now, the problem is there's also going to be costs if we don't have high GDP. So if there aren't as many goods and services available, right, kind of the flip side of that is we have utility be lower for our consumers, which would produce a lower quality of life. Okay. And then, we think about less production generally means, well, if companies aren't producing products, they don't need workers. And so if we have low GDP, that actually means we're creating unemployment, right? We have individuals who would be willing and able to work, but the companies aren't producing very many units, so they're not willing to hire as many of the individuals in our population. So nice graph of this. There we go. I kind of took this from, I believe this was the Bureau of Economic Activity, but it could have been from Fred. But it shows that if we were to look at various points in time, we kind of plot them all out on a scatter plot. So each one of these points represents a different year. When we see the growth of GDP be higher, so that means we have an increase in GDP, and we'll talk later on, we're going to use not nominal, but real GDP. When those growth rates tend to be high, right, positive values, unemployment is relatively low. Right? So that's, I flipped this. So when GDP is generally low, right, low growth rates, we don't have many products being produced, we're going to see unemployment is high. When that growth increases, we have higher GDP, there's more workers who are going to be hired. Well, then we see the change in the unemployment rate actually goes down. More individuals are being employed, we have fewer individuals being unemployed. So this is one of the reasons why we care about GDP, right? Because it's highly linked to employment. Also, to kind of this quality of life of our population, our citizens. So we kind of already talked about, we have this cyclical nature of our economy. Anything that's consumed is being produced. And so we're going to have two measures of this, right? Which is our income and our expenditure approach. So the expenditure approach adds up the dollar value of all final goods and services that are being consumed in our market, right? So this would include not only the consumption of goods or consumer spending, but also the consumption or the expenditure of businesses for having to pay for workers or wages. Now, it won't just be wages. We'll talk later on. This could be interest that's paid on loans, rent. So this is kind of the idea of what we're paying for machinery. And then we also have the income approach. Because we have this cyclical nature, another way we can measure GDP is not the final dollar value of all final goods and services that are being purchased, but what the kind of current income that is being made or the total production value to both households and businesses. So the total output that businesses are providing and the total amount of factors of production households are providing. Or, can you think about this as how many hours of labor or hours of work households are providing to businesses. But no matter what approach we use, because every transaction has a consumer and a producer, it doesn't matter if we use the income, or you can kind of think about this as the production approach, or we use the expenditure, you can think about this as the kind of consumption approach. So these should be the same because of what we said earlier. Every transaction has a producer and a consumer, some level of output and some amount of units that somebody is purchasing. Okay. So this circular flow that we have from this in our economy. All right, so we've kind of got through some definitional stuff here. What is actually going to be included in our GDP calculation? Okay. So our GDP calculation is going to be, if we use the expenditure approach, the value of the goods that individuals are consuming, right? So this is kind of our idea of price times quantity. We'll call this C, it's consumption spend, right? How many goods, final goods and services are being purchased. Now it's also going to include the consumption of businesses of capital goods. So investment in the capital goods would be things like how much are companies investing in the discovery of new technologies, how much money are they investing in capital goods also refers to the goods that we're using to make final products. So this would be how much money they're spending on the intermediate products, right, to get these final goods. So we're going to call this I. So factories that they're purchasing these buildings, machinery, etc. And then government spending, right? So another consumption we have is not just by the individuals in our economy, but also by the government, right? We pay taxes, that goes to the government, they then spend that money. And one way you can kind of think about taxes really are a consumption of individuals because they're having to pay for government services. So we'll kind of call this government spending G. And then, and that provides us with a bunch of different public goods that we all then get to use. So roads, public universities, etc. So even IU would technically be, included in GDP. It's money that the government is spending on these public universities. We then have one, which is actually composed of two different things, which is net exports. So generally, if you see this, I tend to write out the full equation, but if you're looking at outside help sources, you might see this referred to as NX or net exports. So what net exports are, it's the amount of units that we are exporting minus the number of units we're importing. So let's think about why that's the case. Well, if we're looking at gross domestic product, what is being produced, right, is what we're sending to other countries or exports. So we want to include that in our economy's production, right, in our gross domestic product. However, when we're importing goods, even though that is being consumed, right, we're buying goods from other countries, it's not goods within our country. Right? There's no production of that product within our economy. It's coming from another country or another economy. So instead of adding in imports, we actually subtract. Right? So they kind of show up in consumption spending, but the production is not actually coming from the US or whatever country we're looking at. So we would want to subtract that out. We don't want to include the value of those imports. So this leaves us with our GDP calculation, which is consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus our net exports, spending on domestic products minus our spending on foreign country products, right? Any questions before we keep moving here? This shouldn't be, we're just kind of giving some definitions here for a second. So really this is just kind of a addition, and subtraction equation. So if we think about these different goods, we'll break them down into categories and then we'll talk about the actual calculation of GDP. So just to be a little more specific, if I asked you questions about this, consumption goods can be broken down into two categories. So durables and non-durables. So what is a durable good? Typically, this is any good final product that is being consumed, right, or purchased by consumers that has a lifespan of more than 3 years. So examples of this, automobiles, computers, appliances, even mutual funds. Consumptions of goods don't have to be the typical ones we're thinking about. If I'm using my income to invest into mutual funds, that's technically consuming a good. The good is just a financial product. Now, hopefully, things like appliances and automobiles last more than 3 years. So this is why I use the example of these are durable goods. Now, non-durable goods is the exact opposite. Any good that has a lifespan less than 3 years. So this is going to be most food products, cigarettes, right? People use within 3 years. Car insurance, technically, right? Anything we spend money on that the contract actually is eliminated within a year, usually for car insurance. That's a non-durable good. Right? When I purchase it, it doesn't last for more than 3 years. I have to repurchase car insurance. So these are our durable and non-durable goods. Now we also have services right, that we might purchase. So these are going to be things that we necessarily can't measure, right, or these kind of intangible commodities. Okay? So, these aren't necessarily something I'm getting a actual physical product for. It's intangible. This might be I'm paying for someone to do my taxes, right? I'm purchasing a service, although I don't have like an actual physical product that I have in front of me. So another example of this would be Uber or Lyft, right? I'm just paying for this ride. Once I, use that service, it's gone. Not only does it have a lifespan of less than 3 years, it technically doesn't have a lifespan. Okay. So these are our kind of 3 different categories of consumption goods. We can then think about investment, can also be broken down. Think about what types of investments would be included. So when we say investment, this is, we're using the expenditure approach. So this is the purchase of goods by businesses. So this would be equipment, machinery, the factory or the production facilities that they would need, or the consumption of any raw materials. So if I'm increasing my inventory, right, of all the raw materials I have, that would be included in my investment category. What's not included, what we might kind of get tripped up with thinking about, is things like personal savings or stocks. I already mentioned this. It's not investment by companies. It's actually consumption, right, by our individuals. It's just a financial product that's being consumed. So that one's just tricky by the nature of how we typically think about investments. This is just the investment of companies, not the investments, right, of personal savings or of our consumers. And then government spending, simply going to be, adding up how much money the federal, state, and local governments are spending on different public goods. All right. So those are our 3 categories, excluding exports and imports. We can then think about, really already went through this, but the reason why we add in exports, even though it's another country purchasing them, right? So it's not showing up in consumer spending by our individuals. It is units that are being produced in our economy. So we would add in these exports because it's going to generate revenue for our companies. Now, why do we subtract out imports? We already said, even though our consumers are purchasing this, they're purchasing them outside of our country or not domestically. Okay. Excuse me. Or if it's easier to think about, exports generate revenue for our economy. Imports are actually increasing our expenditures, right? We're purchasing them outside of our economy. And then I said net exports. This is, or the net benefit of these 2 things. We can think about this as our net exports. So these are our 4 different components. Do we ever count NX if it's negative? Yes. In fact, we'll go through some examples. Net exports can be positive or negative. So if I'm importing more than I'm exporting, you can think of that as the revenue I'm generating is less than my expenditures, in which case net exports would be negative. That would actually reduce the GDP of my economy. I'm buying more things from other countries than I'm actually sending out to other countries. Okay. So let's think about then how we would calculate GDP using some actual values. So I've got a link in here. Once again, we're measuring GDP at specific points in time. So this is every week, every month, every year. Right? So I think here this is annual data, and we can actually see the breakdown of GDP. All right. So Fred puts out these values or these numbers. So here's kind of the billions of dollars of GDP, and we can see that over time, it's kind of hard to really get a good grasp on this because here GDP is quite a bit lower in the 50s than it is currently today. Okay. So our economy has been doing better and better throughout time, right? We've seen an increase in the utility that our population will have because our goods and services have increased. Now, what's a little more interesting is, if I'm breaking this down, and it's kind of hard to just looking at it, visually, but it looks like for the most part, consumption of final goods by our population tends to be at the highest percent of our overall GDP. And then kind of the next highest category looks like it's government expenditures, right? Then investments made by companies. And then notice to the question earlier, what happens, it's kind of, can't really see it here because it was so small. Back in the 50s and 60s, more economies were, there wasn't as much global interaction, right? I mean, just the nature of there was no, cargo planes, right? It was harder to get products across seas. And so what has happened over time? Well, now we can start to see that there's actually a higher value of net exports, right? But notice, what are the net exports of the US in more current time periods? They're below zero, it's actually negative, which would mean our imports are larger than our exports. This might be surprising to a lot of individuals. So, how would we actually calculate our GDP? Okay. So, I think the first question I have here is, what's the GDP of Canada? And then what would the net exports be of the US? So, I'll write this out for us here in a second, but we've got these values here. What I would do is I would take the consumption of Canada, C. Investment here is broken down into two categories. So I would add in both of these, right? This is the total amount of investment, total government expenditures, and then I would need to add in net exports. How would I calculate net exports? It's my exports minus my imports, right? So if I'm going through this by hand, I would have my GDP is equal to consumption spending plus investment plus government spending plus my net exports, which was kind of exports minus imports. So from that graph, we have that consumption was 995.1. The total investment was broken down in two categories. So 422.4, 6.4 was the inventory change, government spending. Oops, sorry, there's no discount here. So 377.4. And then for our net exports, our exports were 564.4, but our imports get subtracted out. So we would have this calculation of GDP. If we get this entered into our calculator, I believe it's something around, I think I might be rounding this a little bit, but 1,785. Now you'll get a pretty wildly different value if you accidentally added in imports. And if it helps, if you want to calculate next exports ahead of time, you would just take this difference and then add it in. The problem is when I add it in here, what would I actually be adding in? Well, imports were greater than exports, so I'd be adding in a negative value there for net exports. Any questions just on this general kind of calculation? Okay, so we'll go back to that table in a second, but just to kind of reiterate this concept, my net exports are my exports minus my imports. So we look at that table for the US, their export value was 2,341.9. Their import value was 2,871.9. So our net exports here, if we calculate this, would be approximately negative 530. So when I'm adding that in, that's actually going to lower my GDP because this country, the US, is exporting less than it's importing. Any questions here before we jump back to that table? So the US, that's where I was getting those values. Now you'll notice here, for the countries that I have, what's true about every single one of them? Their export values are larger than their import values. So every single one of these countries has net exports that are negative. Well, if one country has net exports that are negative, that must mean somehow there's at least some countries where their exports must be larger than their imports. Now, the subsample we have here, it just tends to be that every country has net exports that are negative. Any questions on this idea? Okay, And the reason why this gets, might be counterintuitive. So you might be looking at some of these countries and like, well, Canada, the UK, and the US, like, they're producing a lot more goods than other countries. Why are their exports so much, why are they less than their imports? Well, remember, this is measuring kind of not necessarily final products. It's if the final product hasn't been produced, those intermediate goods do get included, or raw materials do get included into these categories. So if the US is importing not generally just the final product, but it's importing a lot of the intermediate products, well, they haven't been used yet, so they would get included into GDP. So these more kind of advanced economies, they're likely going to be importing a lot of raw materials and intermediate goods, and that's why we see their import values be so high. They tend to export the final products, but in order to create those final products, they have to import a lot of these intermediate products that haven't been used yet to make that final good. And if you want some additional practice, you kind of go through and do this for each one of these countries here. So we did this work here in class. So the other approach that we have is not the expenditure approach, but the income approach. So for every purchase of a good, there's going to be a production. Okay? Or every sale, there's everyone who's consuming something, there has to be someone who's receiving that money. So the income approach, it's different measures. Instead of the consumption, it's going to be the income that's made by selling that good. So consumers, or how we typically think about our population, our individuals in our economy, they're earning wages, right? So that's an income. Rents are going to be what we call, the amount of money that's being made by businesses, from the sale of things like raw materials or the use of the different facility spaces. We then have kind of the interest that's going to be paid on loans. That's a positive income going to someone. The profits of our businesses, that's how much money they're making, their income. And then depreciation of our different machinery that's going to kind of represent some additional income that we're seeing these companies. And then indirect business taxes. This is something that's going to the government. So instead of government expenditures, you can think about indirect taxes. Business taxes are actually like revenue or income for the government. So it's just the flip side of everything that we were looking at before. Oh, sorry. So once again, why did it produce the same values? Our circular flow model. Every expenditure, right? That money is going to be income for someone else. Okay. All right, so we can break this down. Right? Doesn't matter which approach we use, we should come up with the same value. So if I instead use that income approach, I just have those same categories. They should match up with the way we were calculating GDP through the expenditure approach. So another thing that we didn't do with the expenditure approach is anytime I know GDP, if I have one category that I don't know or I'm missing, I can always find what it is, right? One equation, one unknown, we can solve for that. So let's think about an example where I've got GDP, rent, values, profits, depreciation, indirect business taxes. What must wages be in this economy? So make sure I have these values. So if I'm thinking about GDP for my income approach, that would be wages, right, plus rents, plus, I forget what order I had them. I think it was interest payments, plus, make sure I'm writing these in the same order so this isn't going to be confusing. Which one? Yep. So profits, depreciation, and then kind of these business taxes. So here I just plug in my values. GDP was 400. I don't know what wages are. Rent was 150. Profits was 75. Depreciation was 40. Indirect business taxes were 55. All it is one equation, one unknown. I think if I do this math, I get this would be what? Wages plus 320, which means I then subtract 320 from both sides, which gives me that value of wages of 80. So anytime I know every component except for one, I can always solve for that missing category. Any other questions? Or any questions? Sorry, I shouldn't say other. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So at this point, we'll kind of look at that daily quiz for today. I'll go through this relatively quickly. Let me make sure I have these settings correct on here. I think I made sure it was 10 minutes here. Yep. So we'll preview this and we'll take a look. So this first question should be relatively easy if we just look at the definition of what GDP is when we're calculating it using that expenditure approach. We said it's C plus I plus G plus net exports. So government spending was our G, right? That was an expenditure by the government. Investment into capital goods, machinery, our production facilities, those were expenditures by our businesses. Now, we don't have consumption as an option here, but we know that consumer spending would also be included in this. And then we also include net exports. What were net exports? Exports and imports. So the only thing that's not calculated in our GDP when we're using this expenditure approach would be taxes. Okay. Indirect business taxes were what was included in our income approach. So there we should see what the one that's not included should be taxes. Questions on that one shouldn't be too bad, just kind of a definition that we have. Okay, and then similar to the example that we just worked through, if I know every single component using that, here this should be expenditure, sorry, this should be I changed this around. This should be our income approach because I'm looking at wages, rent, interest payments, profits, business taxes. How would I determine what depreciation is? Well, if we look at this, it's the exact same equation that we had here. So if it's the exact same equation, we had now GDP was told to us to be 150. Wages, I believe, were, what did I have here? 35. Rent was 40. Interest payments were 25. Profits were 20. I don't know depreciation. And then I had business taxes were, I think, 10. Flip something here. So 35. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the quiz, not the slides. Yep, so just making sure all those values are correct. So here it's just a one equation, one unknown. I get 150. If I add all these up, I get 130 plus this unknown category, which subtract 130 from both sides. And I get that the depreciation value in this economy must be 20. Okay, so shouldn't be bad. I think if I'm asking you questions here, hopefully these are easier points on the quiz and on the exam. We just have two different approaches. So even though we didn't go through an example where I was using this expenditure approach, if I gave you any, all of these different components of GDP, I told you what GDP is, I just left one of these out, you could always solve for that category left out. Now, one example that might be tricky is if I leave out imports. Remember, this is always going to have a negative sign in front of it. And so I would actually want to, I'm doing this, how I would kind of solve for imports. I would want to make sure I either multiply both sides by -1, or I add imports and then subtract GDP out on the other side. Now, hopefully this, solving one equation, one unknown shouldn't be too new to many of you. Okay. So here, our answer there was 20. Okay. Everything's in millions, but here we're just entering 20 million. Or when I say 20 million, the value of 20. Also, it kind of indicates this on the problems, but if it ever says numeric next to that problem, that means that you should be entering a number. So you don't need to include the dollar signs. You just are putting in the actual numerical value. questions on this before we keep moving. Have plenty of time for you to make sure you're getting this submitted, but I want to make sure before you do that, if you have any questions at this point, you have some time to ask them. Okay. All right. So the next thing that we will kind of dive into, just like the topic we had in the previous module, is we care about the difference between nominal and real values, or nominal and real GDP. So nominal GDP, we said earlier I was being a little bit lazy with my speech, and I was just calling GDP the sum of all the prices and quantities in an economy. That's nominal GDP, right? So it's using the current prices to calculate GDP. That's the nominal value. But we know that even if the same number of units are produced, if prices are going up, well, we always know that nominal GDP should be increasing. However, if prices are going up, the real value of those units, or the real value of our GDP, was actually going to be lower than it was before. So if we're using current prices, we have nominal GDP. So how do we get our nominal GDP values? Well, all I'm going to do is take each product I have in the economy. Here, I kind of simplified this to coffee and cigarettes. In 2024, I would take the price of that good, multiply it by the quantity of that good. That gives me the total value in my economy of that product. Take the other good, multiply its price by quantity. That gives me the total value being consumed, or the expenditure of that product in my economy. I then add those values up to get nominal GDP. I do the same thing in 2025, but I have higher prices, and I also have higher quantities. So that increases my nominal GDP. I have more goods being produced, but they're also being produced at higher prices. Well, if the increase in prices was even larger than the increases in quantity, then I'm really overstating how much my GDP is increasing by. Because as prices go up, I always know my nominal GDP will increase. So what do I want to do? I want to make sure I can calculate real GDP. So how do I calculate real GDP? To calculate GDP in both time periods, I will use the prices of the base year. So this is a little bit different than when we were calculating real versus nominal values in module 2, because there we were holding constant the quantity, right? Because we cared about changes in prices. We cared about inflation. Well, now with GDP, we're interested more in what is consumed, the number of units, but we want to hold constant the prices, right? We want to kind of take out inflation, because GDP isn't a measure of price changes, it's a measure of production, right? So how do we do that, right? Well, what we'll do is we'll still have a base year, but instead of using base year quantities, we're now going to use base year prices. Okay, so we're keeping prices constant. Our GDP, our real GDP, should be just a measure of, do we have increases or decreases in the output of our economy? So what should always be true about the real GDP of our base year? Well, if we're using the base year prices, and nominal GDP was the current price times quantity, we're using the same prices. Nominal and real GDP should be the exact same thing in our base year. Now, in general, if we have an economy that's growing, even though quantities are going up, generally we see inflation, right? So if we see inflation and prices are higher, well, we're not using those prices. So even if quantities stayed the same, the fact that prices are going up would produce a higher nominal GDP, but because we're using the base year prices, if quantity doesn't change, we're multiplying them by the same price, we would actually see real GDP wouldn't change at all. This captures the fact that when we hold constant prices, we're really only measuring output. However, we can have simultaneous in both prices and quantities. So how would I calculate this? Okay. And we'll think about, if I then do have inflation, what happens to that difference between nominal and real GDP? So we'll go to that Excel file, which I had up on Canvas here, under module 3. So if you want to open that GDP example up, I have this kind of blank. So I already kind of showed you these values. but we'll kind of start to build this out. Just getting a little bit too big. Practice in how we would use, some type of software here is very basic Excel to do this. So we said, calculating the nominal GDP, we're going to just take the value of each good or each category, so the price of that good, oops, a sign here, an accident, times the quantity of that good. We'll do the same thing over here for coffee. Now, instead of doing this every single time, if we drag things down in Excel, it just updates our cell references. So we've got the value of that product in 2025. Do the same thing for coffee. Nominal GDP would simply be adding up the value or the total value of all of those final goods being purchased in that category. And then, looks like I have a typo here. Can't spell sometimes. And then I could copy that down. I've now got my nominal GDP values. Now, if I'm calculating real GDP, what I'd be doing is I'd be taking the price of each product, multiplying it by the quantity, the base year's prices. So I'm going to use 2024 as my base year. I would then add up the base year price times the quantity in that current year, 2024, I'm looking at. So notice here, in the base year, my nominal and real GDP are the exact same value. Okay. If instead I'm calculating real GDP for 2025, I'm going to use the base year price, but whatever the current quantities are. And then I would add into that the other goods base year price times whatever the current quantity of that good is. So if I'm using the old prices, if I have inflation, what should be true is there's going to be some difference between my real and nominal GDP, even if quantity was the same. And I'll show you actually an example of this here in a second. So I've got, yes, real GDP still increased, all right, but not by as much. So nominal GDP is always going to overstate, if we have inflation, it should overstate the actual increase in GDP. Whereas real GDP actually captures holding constant prices, it should reflect, or more accurately reflect, just the increase in output in our economy. And I don't think I have this in the completed example, but just to give you an additional example. So let's say I had 2025 example 2 here. So let's say prices are higher. And let's say here I had the price of coffee set to be higher here as well, but the quantity I'm going to keep the same. So if I'm calculating nominal GDP, I would still find the total value of these products in both years. Notice quantities haven't changed, but the prices have. So nominal GDP will actually capture some of the effect of those prices, right? Quantity hasn't changed at all. So our economy is not producing any more units of these products. It's just that their value is increased in the sense that their prices have increased. So if I instead look at my real GDP, that's using the price in my base year, multiply that by the current quantity that I have, and then add the price of my base year for the other product times the quantity I see in this year. So in this second example, quantity hasn't changed, but prices have. But by using the base year prices, real GDP should only reflect changes in quantity. So if I hit enter here, what should happen to the real value of my GDP? It should be the exact same as it was in 2024. Sure enough, it is. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. Where are we at in time? Trying to think about how much time we want to spend here. Well, I think it makes sense, right? A little bit out here just to kind of reiterate this concept. So if I'm thinking about the relationship between my nominal and real GDP. You can think about this as even if quantity stayed the same, right? What happens if prices are higher? Well, if quantity stays the same, my real GDP shouldn't change, but with higher prices, my nominal GDP should go up, which means the nominal GDP will always be greater than my real GDP if prices increase or we have inflation. If instead I happen to have deflation or prices are going down, well, my real GDP controls for prices. So if I keep producing the same number of units, my real GDP from these price decreases, I'm still using the base year's prices, it shouldn't change at all. But when I'm calculating nominal GDP, because those prices are lower, nominal GDP would be lower, in which case we would end up with nominal GDP being less than our real GDP if we had deflation. So this is once again a good example of, even though the quizzes and things like that aren't cumulative, we're continuing to build, right, on previous concepts so they are comprehensive. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So I'll save this just so I'll kind of repost this since I went through, we had enough time, I added in the second example. But just for those 2 years, you kind of have the work that we did, and we're now going to talk about this final category, which is our GDP deflator. Okay, so we worked through these examples. Let's take a look at this here. So we know that we want to use real GDP and not nominal GDP because it more accurately captures whether or not the production in our economy is going up, and it holds constant prices. So one way that we can compute real GDP so that we can compare across time is using a GDP deflator. All right, so instead of going through this process of using the old prices, we can use the actual kind of nominal real GDP values to then calculate something that should scale our nominal GDP always to the real GDP. So if I think about my GDP deflator, is that ratio in the current year of, or the difference between nominal and real GDP. So it's not the difference, and I'm not taking nominal minus real, it's that ratio, right? Relative to my real GDP, how much higher is that nominal GDP? And then my GDP deflator, I have this ratio. I want to kind of then have that value reflected, scale it up so that I can see 100. So if the nominal kind of GDP is the same as the real GDP, I end up with a GDP deflator of 100. Actually, here. So there we go. So what would be the GDP deflator of, sorry, this is actually on the wrong side. On the wrong side of my equation. I'll update the slides later. So here's my equation for the GDP deflator. What's going to happen if that nominal GDP is greater, or sorry, what would be true about my nominal and real GDP in the base year? Well, we said they'd be the exact same value, so I should get a GDP deflator of, well, if these are the same value, this would be 1 times 100. I should have a GDP deflator of 100. How could I use this to calculate my real GDP? Well, I would just rearrange this equation, right? Multiply both sides by real GDP, divide both sides by the GDP deflator, and here would be what I'm left with. Okay. So just rearranging this equation a little bit, this is how I would take a nominal GDP and calculate my real GDP. Shouldn't be anything too crazy. They're just moving components of an equation around. Just to make this point, if prices are going up, what is going to be happening to my GDP deflator. We said in the previous slide, if prices are going up, even if my quantity was the same, so when prices go up, if quantities remain the same, we're still using base year prices, that real GDP, right, should remain constant, but those higher prices would increase my nominal GDP. So if prices are going up, even if output stayed the same, we had the same real GDP, but we had higher nominal GDP, my GDP deflator in any year after the base year, if we have inflation, should be greater than 100. Because that fraction with increased prices, nominal GDP would be impacted by that. We're holding constant prices with real GDP, so that would remain unchanged. This fraction being greater than 1 means my GDP deflator would be greater than 100. So if I ever have inflation, which, if we look over time, I've got a graph here in a second, we generally always see inflation in our economy. So our GDP deflator should be greater than 100 in most years. So how would we calculate this using the same kind of table we were looking at before? Well, I would calculate my GDP deflator, right, in 2024. I would calculate it in 2025. How am I coming up with those values? I'm just using this equation. I'm taking my nominal GDP, dividing it by my real GDP, multiplying it by 100. So how would I do this in Excel, right? If I have my previous example, what is my GDP deflator in 2024? Well, it's my nominal GDP divided by my real GDP multiplied by 100. I would then do that for 2025. And sure enough, when prices were going up, that GDP deflator should be greater than 100. Okay. As long as we're thinking about holding constant quantities or quantities are increasing as well. Okay. Now I could do the same thing here, this additional example, where I said I had quantities staying the same. But let me actually do a third example. Let's say instead we've got the same quantities, but prices decrease relative to that base year. Well, if prices decrease relative to that base year, but quantities are the same, that means that my nominal GDP, I'm multiplying by lower prices, should be lower. So if my nominal GDP is lower, and it's what's in my numerator, this fraction would be less than 1, which means my GDP deflator should be less than 100. We'll see if this is the case. So once again, we can calculate those total values of each good, simply price times quantity. I'll do the same thing for coffee over here. Nominal GDP, I would just be adding up the value of each good, or think about taking the price times the quantity of each good, adding them up. And what I see here is my nominal GDP has went down. Okay, I've got the same number of units. So really the production of my economy hasn't changed at all. But because my prices are lower, my nominal GDP falls. Well, if I calculate my real GDP, what ends up being true? Well, real GDP is taking the base year prices, multiplying this by the current quantity. Add to that the base year price times the current quantity. So real GDP does not factor in prices. Okay. So when I look at this, similar to before, I'm controlling for prices, whether I have inflation or in this example, we'll call this E3 when I post this. This is this example where I have deflation. And this was an initial example where I had inflation. So we said when I've got inflation, right, if I calculate these GDP deflators, right, I'm going to actually see that GDP deflator is higher. Okay? It's just my nominal divided by my real times 100. However, my GDP deflator, if I have deflation, well, there my nominal GDP is less than my real GDP. So this should be less than 1, which means my GDP deflator should be less than 100. Sure enough, if we do this, we see our GDP deflator is no longer 100, it's 83.33. So this just kind of goes to show, if we have that GDP deflator, we're using it to scale nominal GDP, it doesn't capture price changes. Our real GDP only captures our changes in output. And then just to make this point, we rearrange this equation. Real GDP is nominal GDP divided by our GDP deflator. So another way of calculating our real GDP, if we were just given the GDP deflator, so let's say for whatever reason I left out the data in a table and I just gave you the GDP deflator of each year and I gave you the nominal GDP. You can always calculate real GDP by taking the nominal GDP and dividing it by the price deflator. So if I take nominal divided by the price deflator, oops, sorry, I forgot one thing, which is to multiply by 100. What I'll see is this, there we go. I end up with the same real GDP values. There's a different way of doing the same thing. Any questions on that idea before we kind of keep moving here? So I think where we're at in time. We can do this here. Kind of set us up for next class. So if I have real, nominal, and GDP deflators for a bunch of different time periods, notice in all of these time periods, even once I use this GDP deflator to create real GDP is always, looks like it's always increasing. So remember, real GDP is controlling for prices. So this is just output. So this economy has seen an increase in output. So we've got increases in output even after factoring in or controlling for the changes in prices. If I'm looking at this table, what must the base year be? Well, the base year is always where I would have a GDP deflator of 100. If I have a GDP deflator of 100, what should be true? My nominal is always the same as my real GDP. Questions on that before we keep moving here? So what years will GDP deflator be less than 100? Any year before the base year. Now, what if instead I changed my base year to be 2016? So if I change my base year to be 2016, where will my GDP deflator be 100? In 2016, right? Because our GDP deflator is our nominal divided by our real GDP. Whereas if I'm using 2016 as my base year, the prices I'm using to calculate real nominal GDP would be the exact same. So that GDP deflator, if I use 2016 as my base year, would always be 100. In which case, if I have inflation, any time period before that, I would have a GDP deflator now that's less than 100. And any time period after that, I would have a GDP deflator that is greater than 100. But even if I do that, the directional changes of my real GDP would remain the exact same. It'll change the values in the sense that I'm using a different base year, but other than that, it won't kind of change the direction. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. I want to give a little bit more insight into why our real GDP is less than our nominal GDP if we have inflation. Okay. So if we have inflation, when you think about what's going to happen. So if I have inflation, I can think about my nominal GDP relative to my real GDP. Now, and we could do this just for one good. My nominal GDP would be the price of that good in time period. Sorry, we'll look at time period 2 times the quantity in time period 2. Or I could think about this, I could choose actual years. So 2010 times 2010. Real GDP is the quantity in the current year times the older year's prices. So this would be like the price in 2009 times the quantity that I have in 2010. So if I rearrange this a little bit, I could move this over. So let's say I have a scenario where nominal GDP is greater than real GDP. So I'm just going to move this around. Okay. So if I have subtracting this from both sides would mean the difference between nominal and real GDP, if it's greater than 0 or my nominal is greater than my real, I'll rearrange this a little bit here. Notice I've got quantity of 2010 in both of these. So this would be so what's the only way nominal GDP is greater than real GDP? Just rearranging that equation, it's anytime this is greater than 0. Well, you can't produce negative units, so this would always be positive, in which case I would need this to be positive. When would that difference or the change in prices be positive? If I have inflation. Okay. So that's the only way I end up with a nominal GDP being greater than my real GDP. Any questions there before we keep moving here? So the exact opposite would be true. If I had deflation, I know that my prices are going down, so this would be negative or less than 0, in which case that would mean if I have deflation, my nominal GDP would be less than my real GDP. I think about this as two scenarios. Well, there we go. So just a little bit of support as to the kind of thinking about why inflation and deflation will cause these differences in nominal and real GDP. You can also think about what's going to happen. I know I've got just a couple minutes here, but what happens if my inflation is increasing? Well, if inflation increases, the difference in these prices is increasing, which means that the gap between nominal and real GDP must be getting higher. Or I could think about this as nominal minus real. That difference must be getting larger as inflation is larger. And that's because when I calculate my real GDP, I'm controlling for price changes. Any questions on that before we wrap things up here today? So before we end here, just as kind of a reminder, if you're not watching live, that June 25th daily quiz, because it's always two classes after tomorrow's class on Friday, or then the following class on Monday. It's due before class starts on Monday. Also on Monday, we'll finish up, module 3 tomorrow, and then module 4 will start on Monday. So this, there it is. That module reading for module 4 is due before we start class on Monday as well. And I'll reiterate this tomorrow. And also tomorrow, I will have had posted, and we will look at and go through the first Canvas discussion. So I'll post that right before class tomorrow and give you a little more explanation of how to go about completing that assignment. So that just to kind of give you an idea of what's coming up. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. And then the due date for that, I'll have it set to be simply before the first exam, which is next Thursday already. Okay, so things move quickly. All right, I ran out of time. If you have any other questions, feel free to kind of email me. I will try to get this recording posted. Yesterday, there were some compiling issues, so I didn't get it posted until a little bit later in the evening. But it should be posted pretty quick after class today. Okay.
Thank you.